Welcome to today's deep dive. We usually think of smart technology, right? Like artificial intelligence, that smartphone in your pocket, maybe the smart thermostat on your wall.
Right.
We think of it as this thoroughly modern phenomenon. Like we imagine it was born in the neon-lit servers of Silicon Valley over, the last 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm. That's the standard narrative, yeah.
But today we are exploring a completely fascinating premise drawn from Sarah Murray's incredible research in her book, Powered by Smart, a prehistory of everyday AI. And our mission today is to uncover how our societal comfort with smart technology was actually built over a century ago.
Yeah, and crucially, it wasn't built through computer code.
No, it was engineered through fashion, military uniforms, and the intense physical conditioning of women entering the workforce.
It's really wild when you dig into it.
It is. So to get us started, I want you listening to picture a black and white photograph.
Oh, this is a truly striking image to kick things off with.
It really is. It's from a 1956 issue of Life magazine. So in the center of the frame, there's a woman. Her name is Ruth Feldheim, and she is dressed immaculately.
Very mid-century chic.
Exactly. She has this thick pearl necklace, a sensible tailored blouse, a pencil skirt, and her dark hair is perfectly swept up. But standing right behind her, literally hovering over her shoulders, is this massive mechanical, multi-armed robot.
Built by General Electric, right?
Yes, built by GE. Its name is Yes Man. And what is this highly advanced, incredibly powerful cybernetic machine doing? It is gently, very delicately, helping Ruth into her tailored coat.
And the contract in that photo is really everything.
Yeah.
I mean, Yes Man wasn't designed to be a butler.
No.
It was originally engineered to handle highly radioactive nuclear aircraft components.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a piece of heavy-duty industrial machinery. Yet, for its massive public debut, General Electric decided to showcase its most cutting-edge artificial intelligence doing something, intimately domestic.
And that raises the million-dollar question for you listening. Why did the engineers choose that specific, highly choreographed domestic image to introduce the public to artificial intelligence? Why a coat?
Well, to understand that choice, we really have to travel back and look at how the word smart has historically been used to describe human bodies. And more importantly, the concept of control.
Right.
The word itself has this bizarre and revealing history that perfectly explains the GE photo.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the etymology of smart is a wild ride.
It really is.
If you go back to the 14th century, the word didn't mean intelligent at all. It meant physical pain, literally. A smart hurt was the stinging, sharp pain you'd get from being struck by a whip.
And we really need to sit with the mechanics of that for a second. Think about why a whip produces a smart hurt. It's about an immediate, acute bodily responsiveness.
Right, like an instant flinch.
Exactly. When you are struck, your body reacts instantly and involuntarily. It is the ultimate expression of external control over a physical form. You're responding precisely to the person holding the whip. So that foundational meaning is entirely rooted in the body and, tactile compliance.
But then society changes. As we move into the 18th century, the Enlightenment era, the meaning starts to shift toward mental sharpness. You see this in literature, like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels.
Oh, yeah.
Being smart starts to refer to emotional abrasiveness or a cutting wit. It's still stinging, but now it's intellectual.
Exactly. The sting moves from the flesh to the mind. But the evolution doesn't stop there. By the 19th century, people started using it to describe the natural world. They would talk about smart storms or smart rain.
Which implies a force completely beyond human control. A smart storm is something that happens to you, something you just have to endure.
Mm-hmm.
But then, right around the late 1800s, the word detaches from nature entirely. It attaches itself to clothing and eventually to machines.
Right.
So for you listening, think of the through line like this. It's as if the word smart evolved from something happening to humans, like the pain of a whip or the devastation of a storm, to something humans actively use to control their environment. First, through tailored, perfectly fitted clothing, and then through highly responsive technology.
And what's fascinating here is how the word smart essentially acts as a cultural fastener.
A cultural fastener.
Yeah, it takes something terrifying, unpredictable, and new, and it stitches it to something recognizable, manageable, and safe. Think about how we view AI today. Think back to 2019 when scientists released that image of the Event Horizon black hole.
Oh, I remember that.
Right, it was this massive, lifeless, data-gathering void staring back at us. That kind of raw computational power is alienating. It's a smart storm.
Yeah, it's intimidating.
But contrast that with the 1956 Yes Man robot helping Ruth into her coat. The core thesis we are looking at today is that for AI to be accepted into our everyday lives, it had to be domesticated. The raw power had to be made polite.
Right. And if we accept that technology had to be domesticated visually and practically, it makes you wonder how we actually accomplished that merging of human and machine.
Exactly.
Which brings us into the early 20th century, because the reality is, to make machines look and feel smart and safe, human bodies, and specifically women's bodies, had to be physically standardized to interface with them.
The physical domestication of technology really hit a breaking point during World War I and World War II. We had this sudden, unprecedented explosion of industrial and military complexity.
Right, machines were everywhere.
And they were getting faster, heavier, and way more dangerous. At the same time, millions of men were deployed, creating a sudden need to recruit millions of women into the workforce to operate these machines.
But society was terrified of this.
Absolutely terrified. The idea of women leaving the domestic sphere and taking over heavy machinery induced massive public anxiety. The patriarchal structure of the time felt deeply threatened.
Right. To manage that anxiety and to ensure sheer mechanical efficiency, these women couldn't just show up as individuals. They had to be strictly, uniformly shaped to fit the new industrial and military apparatus.
And when we say uniform, we mean down to the absolute microscopic details. Let's look at the military branches, the Women's Army Corps, the WCs, and the Naval Women's Reserve, the waves.
Yeah, the level of control there was intense.
The meticulous top-down male control over what these women wore is staggering. For the Army, Colonel L.O. Grice was put in charge of standardization. He personally chose everything for the female recruits, from their purses down to their panties.
Wow.
Yeah. And for the Navy, they actually brought in the famous high fashion designer Mainbacher to design the Waves uniforms.
And the public obsession with these uniforms was intense. I mean, every newspaper, every magazine covered exactly how these women were being tailored and shaped up. And the psychological goal wasn't just to make them look patriotic.
It was to create a reliable, completely non-threatening image of women in public life. The uniform was an explicit crafting of a smart body. By dictating the exact cut of the fabric, the length of the skirt, and, the color of the lipstick, the military was signaling to the public, do not worry.
Right.
These women are disciplined, they're responsive to our commands, and they have been stripped of any unpredictable femininity that might disrupt the military machine.
And that exact same philosophy bled directly onto the factory floors.
Right. With the women the press lovingly dubbed the heavy metal girls.
Yes.
In those massive manufacturing plants, smartness stopped being just about looking disciplined. It quite literally meant physical safety and machine efficiency.
Yes.
You could just wear your normal clothes to operate a massive hydraulic press or an aircraft riveter.
No, because the machinery was entirely unforgiving. A flowing skirt, a loose sleeve, or an untucked blouse wasn't just a workplace faux pas. It was a fatal liability.
Yeah. The factory assembly line required a perfectly symbiotic relationship between the worker and the machine. The worker's body had to essentially become an extension of the gears and levers, so fashion had to aggressively adapt to wearability.
You see this adaptation in the most startling ways. Take the anecdote about the actress Veronica Lake. During the war, she was this massive Hollywood star, absolutely famous for her iconic, flowing blonde hair. It was her signature look.
Everyone wanted that hair.
Naturally, young women across the country were copying her. But because so many of those young women were now entering heavy factory work, that loose hair became a profound hazard. Women were getting their hair caught in the high-speed drill presses. They were quite literally being scalped by the machinery on the factory floor.
It was horrific. And it became such a widespread crisis that the U.S. government actually had to intervene.
They stepped in and formally asked Veronica Lake to publicly change her hairstyle. They ran campaigns showing her wearing her hair pinned up tightly in a victory roll just to get female factory workers to start mimicking her loose hair and protect themselves from the machines.
It is the perfect illustration of how the biological human body had to be actively molded to accommodate the rigid mechanics of the machine. And we see this across all wartime fashion. This era essentially birthed the concept of utility fashion. Women started wearing slacks en masse, not as a political statement initially, but because they desperately needed the physical flexibility to climb ladders and maneuver around the tight, dangerous spaces of aircraft engines. Shoe stores started selling specialized duty shoes with hidden steel arch support.
Oh, right.
Why? So women could stand at their metal stamping machines for 10 hours a day without their feet giving out. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this era fundamentally birthed wearability as a body-machine interface. A smart worker was simply one whose clothes allowed them to flow seamlessly with heavy machinery without disrupting the relentless rhythm of production.
I hear that, but I have to push back a little here, or at least challenge the framing. Weren't these smart clothing directives actually quite empowering?
How so?
Well, for the first time, women were wearing pants in public, gaining unprecedented financial independence, and proving their absolute indispensability to the global war effort. The press was writing glowing articles calling them the, wise feminine shipbuilder. Doesn't the adaptation of fashion represent a massive societal leap forward for women's autonomy?
I would argue that it was a deeply conditional autonomy. Yeah. Yes, they were gaining financial independence, and the visual shift to slacks broke long-standing gender norms. But we have to look at who was dictating those changes and why. The value of these women was entirely contingent on their willingness to mold themselves to the strict physical parameters set by male factory managers and the machines themselves.
Right.
They weren't wearing slacks to be liberated. They were wearing them because the machine demanded it. Their hair, their shoes, their posture. It was all policed to ensure the machine never stopped running. The smartness they were praised for was, at its core, a mechanism of industrial capitalism, finding a highly palatable, patriotic way to micromanage and standardize their bodies.
So the empowerment was really just a byproduct of optimizing the human to serve the technology.
Exactly.
Which leads us to a whole different kind of optimization, because the standardization of women to serve technology wasn't just physical and visual, it eventually moved into the very sound of their voices. And this is where the drive to make technology feel safe created the very first voice assistants. I'm talking about the early telephone switchboard operators, famously known as the Hello Girls.
This is such a crucial pivot. In its early days, the telephone network was a deeply fragile, unstable technology. Calls dropped constantly, there was heavy static on the lines, and the physical act of connecting a call required physically plugging wires into a massive glowing switchboard.
Yeah.
The public was deeply suspicious of this invisible, crackling network routing their personal and business affairs.
And originally, the companies hired teenage boys to run the switchboards because they were used to hiring boys as telegraph messengers.
Right, but teenage boys turned out to be a disaster for the telephone.
Unsurprising.
Yeah, they were rude, they swore at the customers, they played pranks on the lines, and they totally lacked the social conditioning to patiently guide a frustrated public through dropped calls. The telecommunications industry quickly realized they had a massive PR problem. The technology was already frightening. They couldn't afford for the interface to be antagonistic, so they completely pivoted to hiring young women.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The physical demands of the job were insane. The agility tests these women had to pass just to get hired are mind-blowing. Applicants literally had to perform coordination tests where they were required to hold a baby and operate a vacuum cleaner simultaneously.
Wow.
Yeah. The companies wanted absolute proof that these women could handle the frenetic, overwhelming, multitasking pace of the switchboard without ever losing their cool.
It was a rigorous test of basically corporeal cognitive mastery. You had to be lithe, seamless, and incredibly fluid under pressure. But the physical dexterity was only half the equation. The telephone companies demanded a very specific, highly engineered auditory performance. They didn't just want a fast worker. They explicitly trained these women to project what they officially called a voice with a smile.
Right. And there is this fascinating figure, Harriet Daly, who was the first switchboard operator for the U.S. Capitol. When she passed away, a 2018 obituary actually compared her to being the original Alexa.
Oh, wow.
Because her entire job was to be this disembodied, unfailingly polite entity that magically solved your problems. But, we have to look at who's allowed to be the voice with a smile.
Yeah, definitely.
The historical record shows that these companies demanded a very specific demographic to perform this comfort. They wanted an educated, completely accentless voice. It was a deeply exclusionary hiring practice. The industry was heavily segregated. For instance, the New York Telephone Company refused to hire black operators until federal fair employment policies explicitly mandated it in 1944.
Right.
And even then, executives insisted that anyone hired had to perfectly mimic that specific middle-class, quote-unquote, accentless standard.
This raises an important question about how we historically define trust when it comes to technology. The telecommunications industry recognized that the telephone itself was cold, metallic, and prone to breaking. So they actively placed the massive burden of performing trust and comfort entirely onto white femme bodies. The operators were instructed to absorb the public's frustration. They couldn't show anger. They couldn't sound tired.
It had to be perfect.
Right. The machine was allowed to be flawed, but the human woman acting as its voice had to be perfect, warm, patient, and infinitely helpful.
And when you think about it, that invisible hello girl sitting at a switchboard in 1915 with her highly curated, smiling, completely unthreatening voice, that is the exact historical blueprint for modern AI assistants.
Absolutely.
When you ask Siri for the weather today, or you ask Alexa to set a timer for your pasta, you are interacting with a psychological design philosophy that was perfected over a century ago. The entire artifice of artificial intelligence, the deeply ingrained idea that the machine should sound like a helpful, deferential, endlessly patient woman, was established by those early telephone operators.
Precisely. A century ago, we stripped the individual humanity and emotional range away from female operators to make them function perfectly as frictionless extensions of the telephone network. Yeah. And today, when we build digital assistants, we try to code that exact same sanitized, curated, deferential humanity back into the software. It's the exact same expectation of disembodied assistants.
So, if the switchboards proved that a standardized, carefully curated voice could make people trust the machine, the next logical step was bringing that standardized, disciplined body directly into the private workspace, which brings us out of the heavy machinery and the switchboards and into the post-war mid-century office.
The era of the office girl. As we move into the 1950s, the rigid, mandated uniforms of the military and the protective coveralls of the factory transition into a new corporate philosophy. The era defined it as suitable modularity.
Suitable modularity. What exactly did that mean for the women working as stenographers or clerical assistants?
Well, it meant they were expected to curate wardrobes that were highly flexible for the flow of the workday. They weren't wearing literal military uniforms anymore, but their clothing was still deeply regulated. The attire had to allow them to move quickly between filing cabinets, desks, and typing pools without snagging or restricting their movement.
And there was a very clear, heavily promoted mandate behind this flexibility. Women's magazines and corporate employer guides constantly hammered home the idea that office wear must be smart, not sexy.
Right.
The explicit psychological reasoning provided in these guides was that a woman couldn't be too visually distracting to the male executives around her. But even more importantly, she couldn't let her clothing distract her from the equipment she was operating.
Because in the mid-century office, the relationship between the clerical worker and the office machine was treated with absolute, almost religious reverence. The machine was the star of the office. The woman was simply its biological peripheral.
Wow, biological peripheral.
Yeah. Take the IBM electric typewriter, for example. In 1954, IBM launched a massive marketing campaign called Partners in Perfection.
I love this specific detail because it reveals so much about the mechanisms of control. When you bought this IBM typewriter, the manual didn't just tell you how to change the ink ribbon or, clear a jammed key. It actually included a comprehensive booklet instructing the female typist on the exact bodily posture she needed to maintain to use it.
It was essentially an ergonomic straitjacket.
Exactly. It dictated the exact angle her elbows needed to be locked at, how perfectly straight her back posture must be, and the highly specific finger placements required to flawlessly interface with the hardware. You weren't just buying a piece of office equipment, you were buying a mandated bodily discipline for your employees.
And here is the crucial takeaway. During this era, that intense bodily discipline was directly equated with intelligence and hireable value. A worker's intelligence was explicitly linked to how neatly, cleanly, and quietly she could integrate with office technology.
Right.
Smart dress and perfect posture equated to an alert, careful mind. If you were dressed in suitable modularity and you sat with the mathematically perfect elbow angles at your IBM typewriter, you were perceived by management as efficient, competent, and valuable. You were the perfect frictionless partner for the machine.
It's just wild to think about the sheer amount of psychological pressure and physical conditioning that was put on the human body just to prove you were worthy of the technology you were using. When you trace the entire lineage we've talked about today, you really start to see how the definition of smart has always been this incredibly demanding moving target. It started with the involuntary physical pain of a whip, then it shifted to the uncontrollable devastation of a smart storm.
Right.
Then it became the safety slacks of a factory worker trying to survive a drill press. Then it morphed into the flawlessly smiling voice of a switchboard operator absorbing the public's rage. And finally, it became the perfect, rigid posture of a mid-century typist.
It is a long, continuous sedimentation of behaviors. The actual technology changes wildly from decade to decade, from hydraulic presses to glowing switchboards to electric typewriters. But the fundamental demand that human beings actively adapt, restrict, and reshape themselves to fit the limitations of the technology remains exactly the same. We have spent an entire century practicing how to be smart for our machines.
Which brings this entire historical journey right back to you listening to this deep dive right now. The next time you glance down at your smartwatch to see if you hit your daily 10,000 steps, or you ask your smart home assistant to read you the morning weather forecast, or even when you instinctively adjust your neck posture just so your phone's facial recognition can unlock the screen.
Oh yeah, we all do that.
We do. Realize that you are participating in a century-old tradition. You're actively, willingly fitting your body, your routines, and your life to the machine. So what does this all mean?
Well, it leaves us with a critical thing to consider about our immediate future. We know that modern AI development relies heavily on what engineers call human-in-the-loop feedback.
Right.
The algorithms literally learn and evolve based on how we interact with them day to day.
Yeah.
But if the historical definition of a smart human required us to radically reshape our hair, our clothing, our posture, and the very cadence of our voices just to appease and fit the crude machines of the 1940s and 50s,
How might today's invisible everyday AI be silently standardizing and reshaping our modern behaviors right now, all under the incredibly pleasant guise of simply being helpful? We might look at that 1956 photo and think we are the masters asking Yes Man to gently hold our coat, but looking at the history, we really have to wonder, who is actually being trained to fit whom?